Good evening, everyone. My name is Stephanie Driscoll. I'm the Creative Services Librarian for the Schaumburg Township District Library. And you'll see right now that a pop-up poll has appeared on your screen. And this is just asking you, how many people are watching from your household right now? If you can choose one of those answers, then the poll will disappear from your screen. And really, this just helps us to get a more accurate attendance count for tonight's program. So I'll give everyone a few more seconds to complete this before we begin. Okay, thank you, everybody. And now onto our main event. I am very excited to introduce you to the Executive Director for the Schaumburg Township District Library, Annie Miscavige.
Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Annie Miscavige, and I'm the Executive Director here at Schaumburg Township District Library. I'd like to personally thank you for joining us in our One Book, One Community this year, and for coming to this very special evening with author Emma Donoghue. Our One Book, One Community is so important to us at Schaumburg Library. We love the idea of uniting everyone in our community through reading and conversation. Feelings of connection and togetherness have never been more relevant than they have been this past year, as we continue to live through a global pandemic together. I'm so pleased that this year's One Book, One Community selection of Room allowed us to come together and discuss the very timely themes of community, family ties, isolation, and most importantly, resilience. I hope that our One Book community gave you a chance to connect with your family, your friends, neighbors, and any other library lovers in different and meaningful ways. Tonight, our conversation about Room with Ms. Donoghue will be moderated by Becky Spratford. Becky's a fiction expert and a reader's advisor in Illinois with more than 15 years of experience. She has trained library staff around the world, teaching them how to match readers with their books through our public libraries. And Becky herself is the author of 2 editions of the Reader's Advisory Guide to Horror and regularly writes reviews for Booklist and Library Journal. And I'd like to introduce our featured guest, Emma Donoghue. Emma was born in Dublin, Ireland, earned a PhD from Cambridge, and has made her living as a writer since the age of 23. In 1998, she left England for Canada, where she currently lives with her partner and 2 children. She is the best-selling author of more than a dozen works of fiction, as well as literary histories and plays, and her work has been translated into more than 40 languages. Room was published in 2010 and immediately became an international bestseller. So please join me in welcoming a warm welcome to Becky and Miss Donoghue. Take it away, Becky.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming. Especially thank you to Emma for being here with us. I just want to thank, there was a huge community outpouring to read this book, and we're going to get into the book, but it's so nice of you, Emma, to come here and join us. We're going to have a conversation together tonight. We're going to talk about the book. We're going to talk about, reading in general. We're going to talk about the Oscars, everything. And we're going to use your questions to help us go. But really, just so thankful, Emma, for you to share this, because this book is very personal, and it'll be a great time. So what I really want to start with, because we have you here and we want to ask some questions about sort of being an author and what that's like. And we heard Annie talk about how you became a professional writer at the age of 23. But what I want to know is, what did you, do before that? What drew you to being a writer? And can you remember the first thing you wrote?
Absolutely. I was walking along a suburban street near my home, and I suddenly got an idea for a poem about, I think, a fairy, perhaps. My early subjects were, I remember doing one about the crucifixion from the point of view of a mouse, one about fairies, lots about trees, one about my dead grandfather. It was all grist to my mill, No, what I really remember is simply how exciting I found it to make up words and put them together in a way that nobody ever had. You know, it didn't matter were they good. The point was the thrill of creation. So what I've written may have varied over the years. You know, some things have reached only an audience of my mother and some have reached millions, but it's the same basic thrill I get from, you know, sticking together little Lego blocks of language in a way that, you know, nobody's done before. It remains a big thrill for me.
It's really interesting that at age 23, you were able to be a professional writer and make a living at it. Did you ever consider another career?
Well, I wanted to be a ballerina initially, but first of all, my teacher died when I was about 9. And second of all, my sisters told me at 5'11", I was not the right shape for it. But that's probably changed nowadays, like all the other perceived wisdoms about ballet dancing. But no, writing was my only serious passion. I thought I would probably have to have a real sensible job and then write on the side. And of course, I would have written on the side. You know, I enjoy it so much. I would write if I was in prison. I would write if I was, you know, an invalid in bed all the time. I would always write, but I can't quite believe that I've got away with having it as my main job as well.
That's absolutely wonderful. So you talked about, the early influences of being a ballerina, but what are your influences as a creator? So the authors that you really looked to for inspiration, and obviously did that change over time?
It did. I mean, an early one was Jane Austen, because not only was I named Emma after her book Emma, and I remember exactly where it was on the shelf, but my dad is a literary critic who taught at NYU for many decades, and he had been writing about Jane Austen, and that's why he asked my mother could he tried for Emily Dickinson and Emily Bronte, but for some reason my mother said no, and they compromised on Emma. But anyway, I always felt that Jane Austen's books were a superb example of making the most of whatever your material is. You know, in many ways, she was stuck in a village with a lot of people gossiping, but she squeezed so much human emotion and insight and analysis out of that. And I love the way her books are, contained and yet have so much going on in them. So she'd have been an early influence, whereas more recently, I would say somebody like Lin-Manuel Miranda is what really lights my fire. I love it when people manage to bring together the best of several arts. Like in his case, who else would have thought of combining the 18th century biography they were reading on their holidays with hip hop, with musical theater as a genre? I just love those daring boundary leapers. Another one would be Peter Jackson. I remember when I was breastfeeding our first child, I watched all the behind the scenes videos on the DVD of Lord of the Rings, which showed the obsessive detail into which Peter Jackson and his team would go for every little thing, from the chainmail to the design of Gollum. And there's this amazing moment when halfway they filmed a lot of the Gollum stuff already, and then they have a better idea, so they throw it all away back to the drawing board. So I love that, almost obsessive dedication to getting your art right.
And you've mentioned film and plays, and in your biography, we also mentioned that you are a playwright, but it seems to be that you're doing a lot more novels now. Do you feel like, though, your experience as a playwright does show up in your books?
Oh yeah, they all feed into each other. Yeah, I mean, it happens. Fiction is how I've made my living, but I go back to theater every few years, and then more recently I've gone into film, and it's all the same stuff. And in every case, what I enjoy most is the dialogue. I just love, once I have characters I know well, I could just, as if they're glove puppets, I could just have them chatting away to each other till the cows come home. In fact, occasionally I have to remind myself that not every character should be as gabby as an Irish woman. So I occasionally have to put in a pause or a silence. But no, I would say dialogue is the kind of beating heart of whatever I write. I would never write anything without dialogue. And I love the way these different forms actually have different virtues of their own. Like if I write something and adapt it into another form, it changes because the other form has got different qualities. So theater and film are quite similar in that they're both time-based. You've only got about an hour and a half. You're aware of the audience. You can tell how long they've been sitting on their sits bones, as my yoga teacher calls them. So, you're really aware of the timing, like not to let anything hang too slowly. Whereas a novel, people are reading it at their leisure. So completely different rules, much more leisurely. So I really like the way each art form has kind of character of its own.
But I can actually see some of that now that you're saying it, because you write what we call literary fiction, right? For lack of a genre.
I
But
guess, though, who knows what that is really?
I know. That's why right. So, but the fact is that your stories, if we take all of the books that sort of fit in there, your novels do move at a different pace. They're not, they're not James Patterson action thrillers, but they're, they move because of the dialogue and the characters. You don't keep people standing still for very long, which makes sense then with all your work with dialogue and being a playwright.
Yeah, yeah. And another thing I find really helpful is because I've worked a lot with actors, when I write fiction, I kind of call up the characters in my head and have them speak to each other. It feels very interactive. And I read everything I write aloud in the final draft to see if the sentences are the right length and the right rhythm. Because when I'm promoting my books by doing events, whether in person as it used to be, or this year online, you have to read your own fiction. So you don't want to discover only at that point that the sentence is too long. So those skills of kind of, theatricalizing and dramatizing something, I think those are useful to me in whatever form I write in.
It's interesting because we do have a question about your writing process in general. Now that we're starting to talk about that, I'm going to bring it up. And it came from Josie from Schaumburg. And she wrote, what is your process for writing this novel and others? And what type of workflow do you suggest for other aspiring authors out there? And I would actually ask you to add a little bit to that, just not just about for aspiring authors, but your books are very different. But it does sound like you do have sort of a similar approach from project to project. But give us a little peek behind your creative process.
Sure. Now, I would never recommend this to somebody else because everyone's got their own methods. Some people would be horrified to hear that I have several projects on the go at the same time. So I might be doing something for a couple of weeks, but then I'll get back to the other thing, and then I'll be making plans for the future thing. Some people, that would sound like having 10 children or something. I'm from a family of 8 children in Ireland, so maybe I like to keep my house metaphorically full of visitors, But I'm a huge planner. I think because I plan things so much and in such detail, that's what actually allows me to maybe, dash off and do a TV draft of something and then come right back to chapter 5 of the novel. Whereas if I wasn't planning the novel in advance, I might be completely lost by that journey away from it. So I think planning is a real friend, especially actually to writers who are just starting out, because a novel can't be just done on the fly unless you're very experienced, I would say. It's a rather terrifyingly long and elaborate business. So I'm a huge recommender of planning, and planning does not kill the joy, by the way, because your characters can still, deviate from the plan. That's fine. It's not like architecture where the building is going to fall down or the unions will object or it'll run over its budget. If I plan something in a novel and then I get to that point and I don't like it, of course I can change it. The plan gives me some kind of guidance through the wilderness. The plan helps you not be too terrified of that blank screen. So yeah, I plan what's going to happen in each chapter. And another great thing about that is that then I can see, not much is happening in chapter 3. So maybe let's just skip chapter 3. Let's just cut it. So planning lets me really improve my plots. Plotting is really not my main talent. I would say I've had to really work at making my plots better over the years. The gab comes naturally, but the plot is an acquired skill. So planning is hugely helpful. And then you can also, like in my chapter plans, I would put a little asterisk if the readers are learning some new bit of information. And again, I might be like, oh, look, all the secrets seem to be spilling out in chapter 7. Maybe spread them out a bit, save something till the end. So yeah, I'm a big fan of planning. And another thing I would say I do is a huge amount of research, and you can't be skimping on the research. When I write historical fiction, which is about half my time, obviously you have to do a huge amount of research, because with historical fiction, literally halfway through the first sentence, you're like, oh, hang on, was it buses or trams in those days? And how much would it cost? Did you pay at the beginning? Would you have to have the exact change? So you have an endless list of queries to answer. But even with my contemporary fiction, I did a novel once about a flight attendant called Landing. And I thought I knew about flight attendants because I'd been on a million transatlantic flights, but it turned out I had no idea how they spend their time and how all those mysterious little cupboards latch together. So I had to read, blogs by flight attendants and customer complaint blogs complaining about flight attendants. And I had to do really detailed research. So never skimp on the research and plan would be my main bits of advice.
I like your comment about planning. And then before, in the other question, you talked about your characters and they're talking to each other and they're talking to each other in your head. So my question is, have your characters ever hijacked a story from you and blown up your plans as you got to know them better?
Destroyed the whole thing, but two of them fell in love. My first historical novel, I had this household of 18th century servants, and that's how I planned it. And then I got to a certain chapter where the maidservant met the manservant, and suddenly things were getting flirty, and I had not authorized this at all. So I was like, okay, this could work, So I let them have a brief, doomed affair because they weren't right for each other. But
well, you are in charge.
Ignore them, shall we say? But I didn't let it get in the way of the unhappy ending either.
I love that.
I'm working on right now. I've changed the ending. I had planned the ending probably a couple of years ago. And then as I started approaching it, I was like, that's too sad, So you have to let yourself tinker with the kind of the dial of pain and happiness, I would say.
That's interesting too, because, that question was about other people who are trying to write. So I think that's great advice in general. I know you said it's probably not advice you'd give, but planning, but allowing the story to also go where it should go is good advice, which leads me to talking to you. You are talking to library patrons, right? We are people, library patrons who love when their new author has a favorite book, as a favorite author has a new book, right? And as soon as it's on hold or as soon as it's announced, they run to the catalog to place holds. And all of us on here feel like that way. And I bet a bunch of people feel that way about your books now. So my question is, are there writers that you feel like that about? Like writing today, when there's a new book, you get super excited.
Yeah. My equivalent would be, mostly I just buy lots and lots of paperbacks because I'm going to read them so fast. And in the old days when I was traveling so much, I wanted books to be light. But there are certain authors I buy in hardback because I cannot wait. So Hilary Mantel would be one of those, Roddy Doyle, Jane Smiley. Those are three names that would jump out. Maybe Julian Barnes. Some people are just, unmissable. And there's nothing like that sheer excitement of having the book. And my partner complains that she can't buy me anything for my birthday book-wise because, she thinks she's got me the book I love. And then I'll say to her that I've bought it a month earlier, But I use the library too. I used to take my kids there very often when they were smaller, and we'd always stagger away with 20. Libraries are superb for making you open-minded because you're not risking anything. So you can afford to take a chance on something that you wouldn't necessarily buy. So they're a lovely device. And then librarians as well are so great at suggesting things.
And that's the other thing too that you bring up. That's a good point, because I always tell people, hey, library books are prepaid. You have already paid for them with your taxes. So take as many as you want, close it up if you don't like it, and try something new. So see, Emma does that too. That's awesome. This leads us to talking about Room specifically, which people have had so many wonderful questions and have connected with it so strikingly. So speaking of, though, the two most striking things about the story that came up over and over again were the setting and the narration. So I'm going to start, we're going to talk about the setting. So you've been quoted as saying about Room that it was the easiest novel I have ever written because I knew what I wanted it to be. You've talked about how you were inspired by reading about an Austrian man who fathered 7 children with his daughter and kept them locked in the basement. You said you were taken over by the idea, quote, of a child born in captivity and raised in secret isolation in the middle of a contemporary city where everything he needs except one of the biggest things, freedom. So, that's a little background for people who didn't know how you did this. You can elaborate if you'd like, but I think the question a lot of people had was, how did you get into the headspace of that horrendous situation? And also, both metaphorically, but also that literal 11 by 11 space because you made it feel so real. So I'm glad you seem fine now, but that must have been harrowing.
No, it was a great writing experience because I felt I had so many things to say just from the early years of parenting. Our son was 4 and our daughter was 1. So, of course, like any hands-on parent of small kids, my head was full of how interesting they are, how alien, how they see things differently, how they see things fresh. You know, how bad we feel when we're explaining our society to them and we realize that something about our society sucks. You know, try explaining why the guy is living on the subway grating as you walk towards the subway. Can explain that without feeling what is this society we've made. So I had so much to say, and the as it were the crime story of Room was just a kind of a spotlight to shine on that parent-child bond and to ask whether if it was pretty great, could it possibly be enough. um and of course Jack doesn't know that he's in captivity, so you know, and that in a way took the pressure off me. I could write it just as here's this kid describing his world, and it happens to be 11 by 11, but you know, it's got lots of things in it he likes. And also, I knew exactly what was in it. I literally logged everything. I had designed the room on the IKEA website using the almost cheapest piece of furniture in every case. I had said things like, okay, Jack's gonna have 5 crayons, one of those little crayon boxes you get free at Swiss Chalet. They will have 5 books each for a total of 10. I, in a way, was their captor, right? I was the one grudgingly doling out their possessions, but I knew that what they would have was love, what they would have was fun and play. So in many ways, it's a really rich world, and Jack is the undivided attention of his mother in a way my kids have never had, frankly. And I put myself into the novel satirically, by the way. There's a moment in the second half where, you know, they're in a place like Starbucks and Jack sees, you know, a mother kind of ignoring her kid and fobbing him off with a cookie the size of his face. Mom, I'm like, look, I've got a friend here, have a giant cookie. I'm certainly not Ma, the amazingly dedicated mother of Jack. But I put into that novel, in a way, every good idea I had about how to be a mother and every idea I had about how interesting kids are. I mean, there's actually nothing special about Jack. He's in an unusual setting, and so his strangeness kind of gets to shine. But really, he's just any kid growing up in you know, particular circumstances and thinking it's normal and getting on with it, and bringing all that vitality and sort of scientific method and curiosity and logic. And they have this wonderful combination of scientific thinking and magical thinking. You know, they try and fit it all together with the Easter Bunny and, you know, coronavirus rules. You can see them. They take all this new information and they just kind of, you know, work it out as they go along. So Room is a kind of a testimony, I suppose, to a child's amazing mind and to the mother-child bond.
It's interesting you talked about that way too, because I'm thinking reading it like she must have locked herself in a room, you know, and but I like that you did design it and think about it all. And the idea that, you know, you were the captor is something I think that's super interesting, because you did create the space. It was very realistic, but the kid Jack doesn't have anywhere else to see, which leads me to other things you were bringing up too about what the story's really about. Because it could have been very easy for this to be a story about the abuse, you know, the kidnapping, the victimization, but really it's not. It's about love and family. And so did you know that from the start, talking about all your planning?
Yeah, you know, it's not that I was going to write a book about a kidnap, you know, rape situation and then wondering how. No, Jack's point of view is the point of the book. That's the idea I got when listening on the radio to some headlines about the Fritzl case. I thought, oh, that child would have a very interesting view of the world. And they quoted Felix Fritzl, the youngest of those 7 children. Somebody had asked him what he thought of the world, and apparently he had said it was nice. I remember thinking, oh, I don't think nice describes it. I bet he finds our world a lot stranger than that. It's not simply nice. There'll be fabulous things, there'll be terrible things, there'll be, you know, chocolate, and there'll be bee stings. So yeah, Jack's point of view is the only one I ever considered. And partly because, in a way, I never wanted the psychopath to win. I never wanted it to be the story of this man who, like, we only give his nickname, Old Nick. I never give his real name. I don't give a backstory. I couldn't care less about his traumatic childhood. I keep him at arm's length, just like Ma keeps him at arm's length from Jack. And I refuse to let it be a story about him. It's all about her and Jack. So in a way, the whole premise of the book sort of reverses the usual way that crime stories glamorize the criminal. It tried to take the kind of shining ordinariness and ability to survive of Ma and Jack and really put them in the spotlight. So narration is key. With every book I write, I sit around for years sometimes saying, okay, but who would narrate that? What would the point of view be? And would they do it, at the time, in the moment, or in retrospect? So it's absolutely all about point of view.
And that's interesting because Allison from Schaumburg brought that up, and she had asked, did you consider narrating anything from Ma's perspective? And you're saying no,
Never.
and so there is that one question though, even after they escape, like that took a lot of restraint as an author, because once they get out of the room, it would be easy to spread it out. But you really were going to stick with Jack, and people seem to love that. So.
But also, of course, there are ways that you can have characters express themselves without being the narrator. So even through like Jack is what they call a hindered narrator. He's a narrator who only understands some of what he's hearing. So I occasionally have him report things he's heard someone say to Ma that he doesn't understand, but that we do. So, a narrator can give you all sorts of information about the world of the book that the reader can use even without the narrator understanding. So I knew Ma would get to express herself quite a lot through things she said. And also the adult reader would be so easily able to put themselves in Ma's point of view and work out how freaked out she is when they run out of vitamin pills, or when the power is cut to the freezer and the food is going mushy. We can imagine that easily because Ma's one of us, right? Whereas Jack, being a small child, is truly different and he sees things differently. So no, I think trusting my instincts on narration was the crucial thing for that book.
And you brought up something when you were talking that Hilda from Schaumburg noted, because, even though we tell it from Jack's perspective, Hilda mentioned that the take home from the whole story for her was how incredibly smart, resourceful, and strong Ma is, because she just is able to focus, knowing what all of us know, right? Because he has that hindered narration, but we know that there's a whole world outside those four walls. And she lets Jax experience that world within the whole world within those four walls. And Hilda noted she was awed by her determination to raise him well beyond all odds. So I think you did a good job with that part.
But there's also a real power to not having a character be the narrator. It can make them very interesting and mysterious. I mean, Ma is the kind of enigma of the novel, because she's literally lying to Jack about how the world is for the first half. And even when she starts to tell the truth, there's a lot we don't know. And we're desperately trying to kind of look past him to get glimpses of what's going on for her. So that really draws our attention to her. And I've never written in the kind of omniscient narrator style where you've easy access to everyone's head. I love the fact that you have to kind of work for it. So because our point of view is limited to Jack, we're desperately trying to figure Ma out, and she's a bit of a mystery to us. And I found in many of my novels, I'll do that. I'll have one character who's never the point of view, but we're fascinated by, because readers want to work, this is the librarian. People are not just looking for escape. They want something to kind of sink their teeth into. They sometimes want to have to struggle a bit to figure things out, or to, handle what's scary or what's sad. And they definitely want to experience lives that are not the same as their own. It's not just about relatability. People want to go on kind of mental journeys and adventures.
I think it's interesting too, because you mentioned they want to work. And that's exactly like if any of you out there are mystery readers, right? We get the mystery readers who really are excited if they figure the book out, right? If they figure out the mystery for the author. And then there's the ones that are really angry if they figure it out before. But it's the same idea, right? It's about the work. And that is an excellent point about your books, because that is true. You don't use that omniscient narration. And I think it does flesh out the characters, as we see from people writing in. They're talking about Ma, they're talking about other characters, but it's Jack. So that's a good job. Before we get away from the setting, though, I did want to ask you, because I read this book when it first came out as part of my work, and reading it in an isolated setting during a pandemic was a completely different experience for me. It was almost like I read two different books. And I know books take on different meaning when they're read at different parts of your life. But how about for you? Do you feel like you look at your own book a little differently now?
Well, certainly, because the experience of writing Room made me very aware of the, the hands-on aspect of child minding and, just being with your child all the time. As soon as lockdowns happened, this time last year, I found myself thinking, oh, all those parents who are cooped up with their kids, and yes, they get to go out for a bit of fresh air, but it's still basically just them and their kids all the time. And there will be wonderful fun and magical times, and there'll be a lot of tension as well. I notice, we've been getting on fine with our teenagers, but there's a lot of discussion of what's for dinner, and I'm the main cook, so I feel this real pressure to provide some interesting food 3 times a day, So yeah, I think that the pandemic has had this, it's really shone this spotlight on domesticity and family relationships. And yeah, we're grateful for them. But if there's any strain there, we've seen a huge uptick in domestic violence in near where I live in Canada. They've been reporting far more head injuries to babies than even a year before. So clearly, sometimes there's an unbearable strain on the family to be everything for people at the moment, and on the home in particular, people trying to do their work lives and their family lives in the home. And so many mothers in particular being run ragged trying to do both those things, not miss the Zoom meeting and somehow keep an eye on the kids doing their remote schooling while also doing their work. It's been a strange year that way. It's really it's asked more of the home and the family than ever before. And I think a lot of people came to Room or else remembered reading Room as part of that. So let's just say when COVID came, I was so relieved that our kids were teenagers. Because I don't want them being around all the time. I love their company, but I did not want to have to intensively, look after them every minute of the day the way you have to, of course, when they're small. So I think
Yeah, it's my kids. We talked. My kids are the same age as yours, and I'm thankful too. I have nieces and nephews who are tiny, but like even reading the book again in preparation for this, my neighbors, I have a 3-year-old. He just turned 2, and they even said like, is he even going to remember this? And I'm like, well, his life is definitely different, being inside the house a lot than it would have been exploring. And so it made me just look at the book in a whole new way. So
yeah, and like the way Jack has to learn rules, like, we don't hug strangers is one rule Jack has to learn, or that if you run up to a dog, it might bite you. I mean, you see kids now just sort of automatically, going 6 feet around everybody. They've had to learn a different set of rules for how to be in the world with people. Our kids going to school in masks, for instance, all these things we would have thought they'd found impossible, and they learn how. Kids are just amazingly pragmatic and adaptable, and even with the uncertainties of, all this year, our kids have been saying, when can I do this? And I'm like, well, who knows? So I think that's something I really learned in writing Room was the astonishing adaptability of children. And I'm also so impressed by how parents just find it in themselves day after day to come up with the fun, even when they're thinking, please let me be alone and far away.
And we keep bringing up Jack, so let's talk about Jack, because there were lots of questions about specifically his narration. It was mentioned by many members of the community, his unique cadence and his voice. They're never overly cutesy, but they still remain authentic to his age and situation, especially in how he sees the world after he escapes, which you kind of brought up. How different it is comes out very clearly. But one specific question I'm going to draw from the group we got was Sangeeta from Hoffman Estates summed up many of these questions by asking, even though Jack's vocabulary is higher than normal, his delivery is not proper. So from where does he pick up that style of both thinking and talking?
Yeah, I thought a huge amount about Jack and language. And I mean, there's a range of normal anyway. It's funny, some people write to me and say, his mother should have corrected him. How can he be so sloppy? And other people write to me and say, he's got weirdly precocious language. How could he have got that good? So there's always a range. But I thought Jack's language would include certainly a wide vocabulary, but not perfect grammar, because I read a lot about this. I think it's Penelope Leach, the child minding expert. She's got a whole, she reports this conversation between a mother and a child where the child is about 3 and the mother is correcting their grammar and it just doesn't stick. The child is not yet at the age where they're willing to accept For instance, a part of English grammar that is not logical, those past tenses. I rang the bell instead of I ringed the bell. A small child will keep saying I ringed because they're like, this is logical. But then at more like 5, 6, they realize, okay, I'm just going to learn how it is. It doesn't have to be logical. So basically, you can't skip over developmental stages in grammar, but you can certainly add individual words. So yeah, I gave Jack a bit of a hyper vocabulary. And I had Ma specifically coach him in repeating sentences off the news in order to build up his vocabulary. So that's quite handy for me because later on he can then report things he hear adults say, even if he doesn't quite understand them. And I also decided that Jack would have a few unusual traits based on the fact that he's got no friends. So I decided he would, everything in the room that there's just one of, like table, he would give it a capital T, and a gender as well. It would be like table, she, because he's got that, friendly approach to things that you see in every kid who's ever played with a knife and a spoon, for instance. So apart from that, I mean, Jack's English is fairly standard otherwise. I went around copying down what my son said. He was 4.5 at the time. And I remember thinking, okay, this language is way too messy. There's no way the adult reader will be able to cope with it. So I didn't make Jack's language as, messy and full of errors as a 5-year-old's usually is. But I think readers also accept that a narration in a novel is not quite the same as how people speak. You tidy it up a bit. So Jack is a bit tidied up, and he's certainly a bit linguistically advanced, but he keeps just a few of those characteristic traits of a 5-year-old grammar. And I think I tried to keep the traits that are very revealing of how 5-year-olds are also confused about, say, time. So, errors of tense, for instance, or the way if a 5-year-old is giving you their address, they might put, the country before the city. They don't see things in our geographically neat boxes. So every time I used a mistake for Jack, I tried to make it one that reveals, how kids think.
Yeah, and because he lives in such an enclosed environment, and Ma and him have so much time together, the time that, like you were saying, and I know as being a parent, you can't give that intense time. It made sense in the story that he was linguistically advanced because she had time. But I do like that you brought up the television, because I do have to say the fact that they had television and how he sort of reconciled to that made me think of all those struggles when my children were little about how much screen time should they have. It felt like, and like I said, our children are the same age. So I felt like there was a little response to that maybe by you, because for them, for Ma, the television gives her things she could not recreate for him.
And yet she's really wary of it. She does not want him to spend his entire life watching TV. So she's sparing with it, and she tries to use it actively. And I decided his favorite show would be Dora, because Dora is a wonderful kind of, cognitive tool. It's all about, teaching stories in threes. And there's that moment when Dora is like, will we go to the Magic Mountain? And she waits almost as if the viewers would respond. So my best ever fan letter was when the creator of Dora wrote to me and thanked me for the fact that in the second half, Jack does not disown Dora. He still likes Dora. But yeah, I agonized over whether or not to give them TV, because I knew they couldn't have the internet because the internet is interactive. I mean, they're secret, they're hidden away, they're prisoners. But I thought if Jack doesn't have TV, then in the outside world, he would be just visually bewildered by everything and helpless. So I wanted him to know things, by their surfaces, by what they look like on TV. But of course, that's not the same. So the first time he's in a car, he's just absolutely appalled by how everything seems to zoom at you. Or he thinks of dogs as lovely, but he runs up to a dog and it bites him, and a bee stings him. So I wanted to get at that difference between the theoretical knowledge of the world that we all have from screens, and then the kind of amazing, vivid sensory experiences, and again, that's something I've thought a lot about this year. Like, yes, you can do a virtual tour of somewhere, but, often I think, why bother? It's not really the place, So I've relied on watching a lot of comedy and drama this year, but I haven't tried to sort of use screens to mimic the travel that I can't do, for instance.
Yeah, it isn't. And actually, that is something else that is highlighted by the book, this inside versus outside and how different they truly are. This same idea of the question we've been talking about, but Eileen from Roselle took the perspective question a little bit further. And I wanted to share her insightful question. one of the greatest, this is from Eileen, one of the greatest strengths of Room is the authentic childlike perspective of Jack, who's relating everything he observes and knows about his world and what happens in that world. But the adult reader understands the subtext of some of these events, as you've already mentioned. So in the scenes in which terrible things are happening that Jack does not understand, were your writing methods for these scenes a little bit different? Were they harder to write? And you know, how hard was it for you as a writer to maintain that child voice but convey this disturbing context? Because that took a lot of, like, clearly your planning came into play there.
It did, because I suppose I was very aware of sort of when he was going to find things out, because he's so logical and mentally busy. You know, like if he sees an ad on the TV and there's a thing in that commercial, which is a thing they have, he's suddenly like, hang on, how did it get from there into our actual building? And so he works out this whole concept about, you know, old Nick goes into TV to get it, but then when he brings it to Room, suddenly becomes real. So he, you know, he works out this kind of logical system of the world in which there are magical TV things and there are real things in Room. And so Jack, yeah, to answer that question, I wouldn't say it was particularly difficult. Basically, I like writing anything which has kind of drama to it, or tension, or a thread pulled tight. It's always harder to write the kind of, you know, calm everyday bits that have nothing particular going on, because they can feel very miscellaneous. So scenes in which Jack is, say, eavesdropping on the bed squeaking or something, and he doesn't quite know what's happening, but he's tense about it. And I really enjoyed writing them. It sounds cruel, but you know, when the writing is going well, that's what gives me happiness, even if my characters are troubled, you know. And I always felt kind of safe that, you know, Ma has surrounded Jack so much with a kind of cocoon of her love. This is not the story of an abused child. I mean, I've read far more distressing books about neglected, you know, abused or mistreated children, and this is not one at all. You know, Jack is a bit troubled in the wardrobe, and he's definitely counting those squeaking sounds, and he wants it to be over, but then he knows he'll be wrapped up safe in Ma's love. So no, I found his holding on to his perspective was a real strength. I honestly never considered deviating from it. But I did tinker a lot with the balance, the kind of tone. I remember in the editing of the novel, I did a lot of going, oh, we've had 2 sweet moments, so maybe a little hint of darkness on the next page. I'll just mention that something's running out, or the Ma's toothache is bad or something. So I tinkered a lot with the sort of tonal dial, but I didn't make any major changes.
And I thought it was funny that you talked about the scene when he figures out how things come in. It made me just think about, you're right, kids come up with things, even in regular situations. I used to think when I was a kid that the traffic lights, right? I used to think there was actually like a little creature in there changing traffic lights, because how would I know anything else? And I didn't think to ask, because in my brain, it made sense. You know, I have been monitoring the questions that are coming in, and we have a few more from people, but I do want to read one that came through on the Zoom that I think is really something different than we've been talking about. This was from an anonymous attendee. It said, while I expected the media invasiveness, I really struggled with the scrutiny and criticism directed at Ma during the television interview after their escape, and yet can't deny that this persistent societal judgment of mothers, even under unfathomable circumstances, is very real. So this person wants to thank you for highlighting this ugly reality, and hope that the future women in challenging situations can find support rather than criticism. But my question from that comment is, did you really do that sort of as a way to look at the motherhood from an outside perspective? Because you mentioned, again, the cocoon of her love. And as we're reading it, we're enveloped in it with Jack. I mean, he even gets wrapped in the rug to leave, right? I mean, it's just this literal cocoon. And so when it comes, it is shocking, even though when you step back as a person living in this horrible world, as you talked about, you're like, oh yeah, that would totally happen, right?
It's funny that television interview scene, when I wrote it, it was twice the length and it was more brutal. And my editors were like, oh no, surely the media couldn't be that mean to her. So I toned it down, but you know, it was inspired by, say, interviews I saw. I saw one interview with Elizabeth Smart, where, you know, a famous crime survivor of a kidnapping. And she had, you know, they asked her about details of sexual assault. And on camera, you see her say, like, you told me you wouldn't ask about this stuff. So they clearly broke the promise of the interview. So I think I've seen plenty of examples of appalling interviews. People are talking a lot about it this week to do with, say, Britney Spears, and how our whole sense of what's appropriate to ask in a celebrity interview has changed. You know, that we're now looking back even just 10 years and going, whoa, he asked her, was she a virgin? You know, so I'm really glad I included all that media stuff, because as you say, it means the book focuses not just on the personal experience of motherhood, but on motherhood as a social phenomenon and how much it's judged. And that all came out of doing the kind of deep research that I recommend. So when I was trying to get information about women who'd survived a situation of having a child in captivity, I was having to get the information from places like, you know, message boards where people would kind of share gossip about these crimes. And I was amazed at how much emotional investment by the people on the message boards there was in these individual survivors. And some of them would be like, oh, she's so wonderful, she's a hero, she's a saint. And then somebody else would be all judgy about, why didn't she try and escape? Why didn't she make better decisions? You know, and you know, I think we have any right to judge the women who got through these situations. So I decided to include that kind of cultural narration. Both, you know, people send Jack and Ma presents and worshipful letters, but again, there's that quickness to judge as well. So I think it strengthens the book then, because it kind of focuses your mind on how your own personal experience always clashes with how the outside world sees you. I mean, I'm from an unusual family myself in that we have two mothers. So, you know, some people find that a bizarre way to raise our children. Of course, to our children, it's just so normal. So I was trying to give that kind of slightly alternative family perspective, that Ma and Jack they're this odd pair, and she gets judged for everything from the length of his hair to exactly which you know, fictions she told him to keep him going. I was on a panel once promoting Room, and I talked about, you know, telling my children about Santa bringing presents, and my fellow panelists scolded me for telling them lies, you know. So, you know, it's a very heated controversy how we raise our children, and you can never quite get it right.
Yeah, you know, and I was thinking about when you mentioned the Britney Spears, it made me think, yeah, imagine if, you know, this was like on Twitter, right? Like if social media had been further along, they would not be kind, you know.
Yes, because then it's even more immediate. People start judging you even before the facts are out. Yeah, yeah.
There's been a few questions that came in beforehand, and even some today, about the whole section outside. So, you know, I was mesmerized when I was reading it to see the world almost with fresh eyes, right, through Jack's perspective. And I have a question about, what did you hope readers would take away from his freedom? But also, we had a few questions about if you had always planned to have that outside.
Yeah,
And then, so if you did, so what did you want people to take away?
Yeah, I planned it as like kind of Easter egg shape, you know, a book in two halves, and I knew the escape would be right in the middle, and I knew how it would end, and I knew it would start with his birthday. So all that was crystal clear to me. And I knew that meant it would be kind of a book in two genres as well, because in the first half, there's this almost slightly fairy tale atmosphere. We're living in this strange little world where things have different names, and there's just two characters, and Old Nick sounds like a kind of a, you know, an ogre out of a fairy tale. And then when we're in the second half, it's much more social commentary. So the book actually kind of changes genre. Not all readers like that. Most people prefer the first half because it's got, even though it's set in a dungeon, basically, it's got this kind of psychologically cozy quality. So a lot of people feel suddenly confused and bereft in the second half, and they get far, you know, Ma doesn't behave as well, obviously. She falls apart now. She's able to fall apart now. She's safe to fall apart. And a lot of people find that troubling. So a lot of people go through Jack's experience of suddenly being like, what's this big world full of new people and new experiences, and I don't know what's going on. So it's funny how nostalgic people get for the Room of the first half. But that, of course, all helps involve them in Jack's story if they're going through something similar to him. I suppose in the second half, one thing I was wanting to do was, if you only wrote the first half, it might seem like I was saying our society is great, and somebody who locked you away from our society should be sent to jail. But if you include the second half, you get to ask much profounder questions about, you know, the really key elements of a childhood, or, you know, even what is freedom. You know, Jack realizes not everybody on the outside is free, not everything is good. he realizes that a lot of things are private property, whereas in Rome, everything belonged to him and Ma equally. So he had no sense of the private versus the public. And on the outside, he discovers, lies and hypocrisies and confusions and inconsistencies, and it's a much messier world. So I found it much more interesting experience to write the book in those two halves. But it's funny how much readers get nostalgic for the first half. Yeah.
I think they get nostalgic for the first half though, because you did make everyone feel so comfortable. And then it's really hard to confront everything that was left out of the fairy tale. And there's a question that came in about, you mentioned it a little bit, that Ma falls apart, that she attempts suicide. And I think you hit the nail on the head for why readers are feeling this way too, because she can finally fall apart. She's been holding, I can't even imagine holding in all of what she held in. And having children, I know I would try my best to do it. I don't know if I'd be able to, but watching her fall apart, all of us are kind of falling apart too. And I think it's interesting that you've heard more people liking the first half.
Yes, and some readers felt betrayed by Ma. They were like outraged because, of course, they don't know she's going to do it. They're seeing things from Jack's point of view, and they take it very personally. But I was trying to be realistic and honest about her experience. I didn't want her to be Miss Perfect. So again, Ma changes because in the first half we see her through this almost fairy tale lens, and in the second half we realize she's flawed and damaged and weak like all of us. So in a way, the reader has to grow up painfully when they move into the second half of the book. And like I was saying about reading in general, we ask a lot of our readers and we make them go through upsetting things. And it's funny, I've had such responses to Room over the years, not just from, say, young mothers, but from teenagers, from grandfathers, people who had unhappy childhoods, women who felt bad about not getting out of violent relationships earlier. And people connect with it in so many ways. I think I was lucky enough to hit on just a very emotive kind of primal storyline, the idea of this enclosed life. And I think one reason it works is that we all go through some version of a move from a smaller world to a bigger world. We all grow up. And Jack just does it overnight. So it's a really intensified version of the human condition, of the coming of age novel. It's like an overnight 5-year-old coming of age novel.
And also, I think because you focused on the love and not the trauma, there's a connection there, because that is like a universal feeling. I do want to start moving on to some final questions. People asked questions about the movie version, of course. The movie was extremely popular and very critically acclaimed. And readers often want to know what authors feel about the movie adaptation. And so Nan from Schaumburg is one of those people. But, in this case, you wrote the screenplay. You got nominated for an Oscar, which is so exciting. But how hard was it for you to take everything from the book? Because it's not like it's going to be easy for you to cut stuff, right? Because you have intense feelings about all of it, plus the things you already cut from the book too. So what was it like creating it for the screen? And then also, did you get to go to the Academy Awards? What was that like?
It was a pleasure, the whole process. I don't think a novelist should take on the task of adapting her work for the screen unless she's really enthusiastic about it. So, you can't just be wanting to protect the work. And also you can't think of it as cutting. I remember some journalist asked me like what percentage I thought I'd kept. And I'm like, that's the wrong attitude. You're trying to recreate something in another language. So I didn't open the first page and say, how do I put this first page on screen? It's more like I said to myself, I want to tell Jack's story, but I'm not using words primarily. You may think the words in a screenplay are the bits we focus on, but actually it's light and it's faces and it's action. You should be able to understand a film watching it without the sound on. So I thought I want to tell Jack's story, but through light and faces primarily. So I thought, what's the first thing we see? And I went for an episode that turns up, quite a long time into the first half of the book. Jack at night sees Ma flashing a light to try and attract attention. And I thought, oh, that's the perfect way visually to show the room. It's like she's standing on the table flashing the light. She looks like a crazy lady. What's going on here? But also I knew that would illuminate the room in flashes. So, from a film point of view, that was the perfect place to start it, where in the book you want Jack directly telling you, today I'm 5. So Yeah, I found it a real pleasure. It was nerve-wracking because it was my first film. So it's not that it was particularly agonizing to throw away my brilliant ideas, It's more that, writing a film at all, you feel like a loser because there's so much jargon you don't know, even the layout, working out how to use the software. So I felt extremely new and inexperienced. And it's a world that has been left to the professionals very much. A small number of, you know, mostly white male screenwriters have written everything until recently. The percentages of screenwriters who are malers they're still really high. So it was a new world to me and a bit scary in that way, but I knew I had this unique opportunity to get into it. So I loved the experience, and I really loved working with our director. And I would say I didn't try to control any of the process, and therefore he let me in. I was part of all the discussions about, we were swapping films, and I'd say, like, oh, did you see Brie Larson in Short Term 12? And we'd trade ideas for casting. And then I loved being on set as well. And I remember feeling I could completely trust these people because their level of obsessive dedication, there was a whole team of prop masters who were, they were using an algorithm to make sure that the cork tiles would be faded just the right amount based on which way they were angling towards the skylight. And I was like, whoa, I think I can safely leave this in their hands. They don't need me hovering over them. And again, the costume person had an idea for how each character's kind of journey was expressed through the choice of the clothes. So I absolutely loved the process. So going to the Oscars was great fun, but that was the least of it. If I had to just pick one part of the whole thing, it would either be the walking around on set, watching all the magic happen, or even those early sessions of just sitting around at my kitchen table with the director, both of us together trying to bring this story to life in another form.
Definitely shocked by, because of course, lots of us readers read the book and then see the movie. And I was shocked by how much of the book was captured in the movie. And I think that's a good point because this is a very visual story. Like, for example, and people have lots of questions about the ending, but for example, like Jack going back, and seeing the place where he lived from a different perspective.
Yeah, and it looks all kind of shrunken and bare, doesn't it? Yeah.
It was moving in the book, but it was on the screen. I think it just was too much almost. People are asking about the ending. They really have enjoyed the ending. Did you, like you say, you plot it all out, but did you really feel strongly about how it was going to end? Like, when you plot it out, do you have that final scene written at the beginning?
Yeah, and I sometimes go ahead and write the final scene. The final scene is so important. Yeah. So early on, I would have decided that the escape would be bang in the middle and that they would go back to room at the end. And that walking out the door, this time, not having to be smuggled out to a trick or anything, not carried out, that it would be like Jack and Ma hand in hand going out the door. And the bit that always makes me cry is, Jack says to Ma, say goodbye room. And you see, Brie Larson does it in a really unsentimental way. She kind of beckons him out the door and then she glances at the room and just under her breath, without even voicing it, she says, bye room. And I just find it so moving that like she follows Jack's advice there. She's polite to room. She says goodbye to it. She doesn't, say curse you or set it on fire or anything. She manages to say goodbye to room and accept that everything that happened there was part of their lives and she can't wish it away. So yeah, I thought the ending was just right. Now, we were always wanting there to be some snow for that ending. And I remember we thought we couldn't quite afford it because apparently snow is made of potato flakes and it's really expensive to clean up from the neighbors' gardens afterwards. So they told me, I'm sorry, you can't have the snow. We were all really disappointed. And then on the day it began to snow, we were so grateful to the Toronto weather for that.
Right before we finish, I do have to ask, because people are going to be dying to know, what are you working on now? And clearly it's more than one thing. So we'd love to know.
It's always a few things. Yeah, it's funny. I published my most recent novel, The Pull of the Stars, in July. It was only meant to be coming out this year. But because it's about the 1918 flu pandemic, my publishers decided to bring it out really quickly. And I thought, oh, well, there'll be no book tour, last July. But actually, they suddenly had these new events on Zoom and Instagram Live and so on, events that I'd never done before. And I thought, oh, so there'll be a few of those. Actually, it's been non-stop online events. I've done more to promote and talk about The Pull of the Stars through online events than I ever did with live ones. And I've got quite fond of them because you can reach people who don't necessarily live in the big cool cities, or who aren't necessarily free in the evenings, and people can find you afterwards. They can watch the events afterwards, they can take part, they can vote each other's questions up and down. So basically, yeah, all year I've been doing online events, and it's great to have had the chance to really focus on healthcare workers, because the Pull of the Stars is all about nurses and midwives and doctors in the flu of 1918. So there's been a lot of that. But I've also been trying to write my first musical with a composer. So that's been fun. That's like a promise to myself. Theater will come back someday. Someday, big, all singing, dancing theater will come back, and I'm determined to write a musical for that moment.
Any more novels and ideas?
Yes,
Sage?
yes, indeed. I'm finishing up a novel too. Yeah.
Good.
Can't talk about it till it's sold, though.
No, that's
I can
fine.
never assume my publishers will buy it.
Yeah.
My novels are so peculiar. The storylines are whack. So whenever I'm about to submit a novel, I think, who but me would read this?
But see, the good news is people know they're all so different. So they expect it. If you wrote the same thing, I think people would be, at least the readers that we work with at the library would not want to read them if they were all the same.
I guess so, but it's just before I've even sold it to the publisher, I always feel slightly like I'm the strange person at the party going on and on about some very, very specialist subject, and everybody's backing away.
Well, Emma, thank you so much for being here. And I know the community was really excited to get to hear from you about your book and about your process. And so just thank you so much for your time.
Oh, it's been great fun. Great questions. Thank you all so much for the questions.
Yes, so a big thank you to Emma and to Becky for this inspiring conversation. This was such a great wrap up to our One Book, One Community program. I know back when we were planning this, it was so important to the library staff to be able to give our patrons the opportunity to view and engage with Emma, even if it did have to be virtual this year. So a big thank you to all the attendees that came out tonight. And of course, if somehow in all of this you missed reading Room, or if you want to check out one of Emma's many other books or her latest, The Pull of the Stars, you can find all that at the Schaumburg Library. So we hope to see you all soon, and everybody have a good night. Thank you so much.